I'd like to start just straight away by introducing our first speaker. He is Desmond McCabe, who's a graduate of UCD and is currently working as a curator in the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland. Having been worked on the official history of the Office of Public Works, he recently published his study, St. Stephen's Green, Dublin, 1660 to 1875, which is a very comprehensive work on the whole history of Stephen's Green, from it being Dublin's medieval commonage to inner city Victorian Park. I believe he's also been involved in a number of other projects, including on the Dictionary of Irish Biography. And now I'd like to introduce Desmond.
Thanks. Whenever I think of European squares, I often think, fairly or unfairly, of this somewhat absurd but unforgettable image of the serene majesty of the Louis XIV, the future Sun King, at the age of 24. It's hard not to think of him as being a fairly big-headed young man. The picture commemorates a tournament, a late version of the medieval joust, in which Louis XIV commanded an army of Roman soldiers against a combined army of dressed-up Persians, Turks, East Indians, and American Indians, savage and opposing civilizations to the glory of France. The inevitable victory of Louis took place on the open ground of the Place Royale in Paris, where the court had assembled to see their king show martial prowess. The image emphasizes the royal associations of the space, and the tournament identified the king with the imperial glory of the Roman world. One of the archetypal patterns of the square in Europe since the 1500s has been the Place Royale, and European squares have tended to more grandeur, scale, and uniformity than squares in Britain and Ireland. However, though this was the first example of its kind in Paris, and although this square exerted a powerful effect for generations on the evolution of the square in France and in Europe as a whole, it turns out that there are not many other squares exactly like it. It should have been easy to copy, but this was not often done. It was a residential square, and that form developed more strongly in Britain and in Ireland than in Europe. The square as such was derived from the example of the Roman Forum, but only those made in Rome during the Renaissance ever looked much like those of the classical world. The square itself as a form holds a fascination that makes it difficult to reach summary definition of the architectural space. Every such urban space is different. Few are actually square in shape, for one thing, as we know. But something of the ideal form of a square seems to hover over all such spaces, no matter what they look like in reality. It might be adequate simply to say that a square is any large open space comprised of enclosing buildings and an open or landscaped interior. But this kind of definition doesn't capture the peculiar character of a square. The problem sometimes feels metaphysical in nature. The Spanish philosopher Ortega y Gasset argued that a person was properly defined as a self plus his circumstance, meaning that the place you were in was part of what you are. In the case of the square, I would say that a square is the architecture, the physical architecture, plus the people in it and what they're doing, and that makes all the difference. The European urban square, as we know it, came into being in Italy about 1400, shortly after the word square itself appeared first in medieval English. But the language of the square as we know it was not coined for over a century afterwards. The English word place was first used to mean an open space in a city or town about the 1540s. The Italian piazza was used first in the 1580s to describe a public square in a town. And the Spanish plaza was first written to mean a town square as late as the 1680s. At the same time, around the 1680s, the word square came into use in England to indicate an open space in a town. So the square existed as a form before the nomenclature emerged, quite a bit before. Let's put this down. Place and plaza and come from the Greek plateia. And the ancient Greek towns and villages had small central spaces, often triangular in shape for communal events. But when the Italian engineer architects of the 1400s and 1500s were designing squares, they meant to hark back to the civic forum of Roman life. This primary orthogonal form was made up of an open space for people to assemble and to attend business and courts, engage in political debate, or to watch and take part in theatrical pageants. The original Roman Forum, or the Forum Magnum, was a rectangular space filled with statues and monuments, overlooked by shrines, courts, and places for the conduct of politics. It served as the culminating venue for military processions known as triumphs. The Forum in Rome was set out in a higgledy-piggledy arrangement, despite the best efforts of some emperors every so often to tidy it up and rationalize it. This higgledy-piggledy form was also the case among most of the early Italian imitations of the Forum, which displayed a strange mix of mathematical ingenuity and organic irregularity. The idea of the square came to France from Italy about 1600 and took more rational shape. Henry IV constructed the Place Royale and then the Place Dauphine before 1610, both stripped-down versions of the Renaissance form. Equestrian statues were added to the mix by the 1630s. The full-blown Baroque form of the space, in which vast space was laid out in daunting linear design, came into vogue in France by the 1660s. The Place Royale that we know here looked relatively homely by then. This larger, wider, more expansive form persisted in different guises until the late 19th century. Now, like most people in Britain and Ireland, I've always had a vague sense that squares on the continent were different in character from those in Britain and Ireland. But I didn't have a clear picture of that. But now, having surveyed some 230 city squares at present existing in 14 major European cities, I found that more concrete research produces the same evidence. The survey I did for this talk can only amount to a sample of perhaps more than a couple of thousand squares in all of the major European cities and towns. The survey, which covers 234 squares in 14 cities, has other flaws too. Some of the cities I looked at were badly damaged in World War II and must have lost the physical structure of a number of squares, and that's changed my understanding of the character of those squares. But one of the things you find is that although squares can change greatly over time, they rarely disappear in cities. So the sample probably accurately reflects the full number of squares made in these cities from the start, when they started producing squares. Most of these squares are oblong. A few of them are circular or irregular in outline. The garden square, as we know it in Britain and Ireland, is very much in a minority. You can see I just broke it down into simple kinds of space. I mean, it's a very simple survey, but it gave me a clear picture. And it confirmed, I suppose, some of my assumptions. You can see there's a small minority of garden squares. Most of them are what I'm calling plazas. And then there are ones which amount to hubs for traffic. And then there are other forms which are miscellaneous. Now, there are sometimes gardens at the heart of the wider plazas, but the closest relatives to our own garden squares probably occur in Paris. This shot of part of the Place de Batignolles shows one of the closest garden squares to what we've got ourselves. It could have come straight from Merrion Square or Stephen's Green. Most of the spaces in Europe, though, consist of plazas of different descriptions. Some, like that in Seville, are very grand, sweeping spaces, relatively unfurnished. People are given no particular direction in that kind of pathless space, and there's a deliberate effect of magnitude in the construction, which can have heart-stopping grandeur at times. Moving about feels almost confrontational and might even be said to take some courage. But if people can be made to feel puny, they might also perhaps be made to feel part of a greater whole. The latter effect was certainly the aim in St. Peter's. Now, these are the great plazas. That didn't come out quite right. The more ordinary town plazas, although still big and unobstructed, are not quite as overwhelming. That's right. That's a Castle Square in Warsaw. And that's a more typical kind of plaza. Again, you see the flat space, fairly unfurnished. And that's Odeonsplatz in Vienna, about 1900. And again, a similar effect. Now, this is Dam Square, and it's an important version of a plaza laid out in front of a city hall or civic office. Although this is a royal palace, in fact, it looks very much like a typical city hall, although it's larger, and the style is very similar to what you find all around Europe. Now, many of these plazas were organized by architects, but by no means all of them. My own tabulation reckons that architects contributed to the making of about 36% of the European squares in the sample. City government allowed for and regulated the provision of open public space and resisted encroachment on it. The plaza was regarded as a vital part of city planning. Now, the simple plaza, as in those made in Parisian suburbs in the 19th century, is exemplified in this image of the Place de Tetre. These spaces combined a simple residential accommodation with shops and workshops. There was nothing aristocratic about them. Regrettably, a proportion of the larger plazas, since the appearance of the motor car, have been turned into mere traffic junctions or interchanges. The openness and plainness of the plaza made it relatively easy for this to happen, and the example of Constitution Square in Warsaw is one of many. Finally, there's squares that don't fit into any of the typologies. One kind is the broad street, enlarged over centuries to cater to market stalls and crowds. And this is an example, that didn't happen? Okay, there it is. This is an example from the district of Graben in Vienna. And it's just a wide space that just grew naturally. Now, looking at the character of squares and plazas in Europe, this table shows that about a sixth or 16% of all these squares are dominated by town halls or major administrative centres such as offices or departments of state. If the 23% of squares accommodating public buildings such as museums, national libraries, universities and art galleries is added to this percentage, then the sum comes to nearly 40% of European squares formed in their character by secular institutions and offices. These squares were rarely converted into traffic hubs. Then, further, nearly a fifth of plazas hold a large church or cathedral. All of these facilities are, of course, reminiscent of the public structures available in the classical Roman Forum. Few of these plazas are residential in tone, although, of course, some of them do hold apartments. There are significant monuments present in nearly half of these squares, generally patriotic statues. The heroic or patriotic statue has been inseparable for centuries from the public space. The underlying idea may be that when the city population takes the air in open spaces, they're brought together emotionally by a common respect for such men and rarely women. But of course, the ordinary population everywhere tends more often to nurse a coarse irreverence for weather-beaten famous figures. Then there's fountains in most squares, more in Rome than any other city in the world, it seems, apart from Paris. The contemplative element of water seems to make sense as a kind of extra dimension provided to the flat space of a plaza, like a wishing well in the center of an arena. Like many aspects of the public square in Rome, the fountain can be a glorious and ebullient grotesque. This is a wonderful Triton. The lines of statuary tend to follow more chaste lines in Northern Europe. The triumphal arch has also been an important feature of the large urban square in Europe since the 1500s. Some of the arches are freestanding, like the Arc of Triumph in Paris, but they're often also built into the lines of building framing the plaza. Then there's numbers of equestrian statues to be reckoned with. The equestrian pose represented martial valor as opposed to the pedestrian pose. These amounted to an irresistible temptation to most Baroque rulers. Now, I've only found one female equestrian statue, and that's a statue to Joan of Arc in the Place de Pyramide. The most recent sculpture was completed in 1901 for a square in Bucharest. Now, this table shows the periodization of these squares. Now, as I say, this has some meaning because few squares disappear. So if there's early squares, the squares really probably do reflect the construction and the progress of construction. Some of them are ancient or medieval in origin, but the square as we know it was reborn under classical influence from the 1400s. It was the aesthetic influence of Leon Battista Alberti which principally shaped the form as it grew. The square at first seemed often to glorify the authority of rulers in the Italian city-states. Alberti codified the architectural theories of Vitruvius, emphasizing that a forum, as he put it, should be laid out at a ratio of 2 to 3 length to width. Buildings were meant to be laid out in dimensions relating sensibly to the space, and usually no more in height than a third of the width of the space. In practice, although Italians took delight in the laws of perspective and in the mathematics of illusion, their squares resisted any rigid sense of proportion. One of the seminal examples of these newly conceptualized or rediscovered rules of architectural order was the Piazza Ducale at Vigevano, northern Italy, built by Donato Bramante and Leonardo da Vinci between 1492 and 1495 at the instructions of the Dukes of Milan. This may also have been one of the quickest squares ever built. This work managed to bring a sense of spatial regularity out of the irregular space given to the architects by setting out a series of large triumphal arches in illusionistic perspective. Now, the triumphal arch was regarded by Alberti as what he said the greatest ornament to the forum or crossroads, and was indispensable to the most perfect squares, and that's one of the reasons we still have it all the time. Another inspiration to later work was the ensemble created by Michelangelo at the Capitoline Hill under the patronage of the papacy, which wanted the space to become a centre for public events and a terminus for processions. You can begin to see the constant harking back to the Roman Forum as it was laid out and existed until about 500 AD, 400 AD. Working with a non-rectilinear space, Michelangelo made the piazza out of trapezoidal and oval spaces laid out so as to organize it along axes that made sense out of unusual proportions. A mounted statue of Marcus Aurelius gave a classical impress to the square. Though inspiring in their ingenuity, the next development of the square did not produce the vital idiosyncrasy of the Renaissance square as it existed in Rome. It appears, among other things, that there was a link between the further evolution of the square and the development of the walk or boulevard, although this was eventually exploited most fully in Britain. The promenade of distinguished courtiers and citizens made open exhibition of aristocratic taste and correctness. Now, since the mid-1500s, French court society was heavily influenced by Italian taste. This became evident when Henry IV set out to embellish the kingdom in the early 1600s. One of his first projects was the creation of what became the Place Royale, the first image that you saw. Later, the Place des Vosges. Now that's the Place des Vosges as it is today. One of his first, it appears surprisingly that the initial vision was for the construction of a spacious residential and working quarter for craftsmen and bourgeois, but this fell apart and was reinstated as an exclusive residential zone for the court nobility. The space approached to a square in shape, unusually, and it was surrounded by continuous 3-story buildings in mansard style. Inaugurated in 1612 for the wedding festivities of Louis XIII and for Anne of Austria, the square was regarded as revolutionary in concept at the time. It initiated the radical separation of the aristocratic and bourgeois worlds that became a hallmark of Baroque society. France, by the 1660s, provided the norms of aristocratic taste in Western Europe, and its architectural models inspired other rulers. In the 1670s, for instance, Christian V of Denmark, levelled the square of Kongens Nytorv, making it a centre for military assembly and parade and a Place Royale on the French model. Land around the square was distributed among the Danish elite, and a Baroque garden complex ornamented by a gilded equestrian statue of the king laid out in the 1680s, according to the developing formula for Baroque public spaces. This is only one of a number. A greater extravagance of Baroque form, evident in France by the later 17th century, was evident in France by the later 17th century under the Versailles court. Even the rearing of a horse at the Place de Victoire seems to mark an ambition and arrogance not discernible in earlier equestrian statues. The French Baroque developed a logical order distinct from the idiosyncrasy of Italian style. Mumford described French Baroque architectonics as, what he said, an absolutist vocabulary of symmetry, axiality, uniform facades, and iconography, making an impersonal impress of royal order in the civic world. Space was reduced to measure and order. The square was felt to epitomize the qualities and aspirations of aristocratic life, and this vision was compelling all around Europe for several centuries. Now, to the late 19th century, Although some few European city squares were adapted to the garden style from the 1860s, the value of immensity and scale remained important in the great European city squares. Although some of the principles of the Italian square were introduced to Britain by Inigo Jones in the 1660s, very quickly the British square became something different to squares in the rest of Europe. The residential quality of the Place Royale was emphasised in works such as the making of Southampton Square, later Bloomsbury Square. And the creation of open gardens in the centre of such squares followed naturally, and indeed also occurred in the Place Royale itself. You saw the image of the Place Royale in the 1660s, which just had that open space used as a tournament. But within 100 years, a formal garden very similar to the kind of 18th century British gardens was developed there. But this is unusual, it's not common. The court promenade had more influence on the British square than it had on squares in Europe. The landscaped interiors of the first British squares were rectilinear open promenades, suiting members of a social elite that wanted to see and be seen. The real landscaped garden square, as we know it now, took another century to emerge in Britain, but the direction of change was well defined by the 1740s. So although the squares in Britain and Ireland have the same stem from the same sources in the Italian Renaissance and then the Place Royales of Paris in the early 1600s, there was a very definite divergence of architectural form between European and British squares from the 1660s and 1670s. Now, I'm going to come back. Now, these are the big European squares that really, up to the late 19th century, they were being produced. They're basically versions of the Baroque. That's Covent Garden. And again, the initial thing was really for an imitation of the Roman Forum. So it didn't really remain like that for very long, but it was the first concept. It didn't really take root. And that's Southampton Square. And now we're back to the Place Royale and Louis XIV. Now, one of the reasons that I also particularly liked this is because of I have this idea that the concept of honour, which is visible in the British Square in the social institution of the promenade and also in the Jewel, among other things, has a link with the culture of the aristocratic square. And that the anthropology of honour has something to do with religion, which is part of the reason why Louis XIV attempted to ground the conduct of life among the aristocracy and among the wider population in the notion of the divinity of the monarch. Now, I'm not saying he's right to do that or anything like that, but there is an interesting connection. We tend to think of honour nowadays as the notion of honour as something ridiculous and archaic, a kind of touchy nonsense belonging to silly male aristocrats who like to prate of being guardians of public honour by virtue of protecting their own. Honour as a sense of worth in the public eye could be lost or gained, and honour means that you care what people think about you. Although the notion of honour was barbarised and distorted by an affected clique who were occupying these squares in the 17th and 18th century, the notion of honour does have meaning, and properly understood has even religious connotations relating to the kind of common purpose and community inherent in primitive Christianity, for example. Grant. Honour represents the sense that virtue can be publicly comprehensible among people of goodwill and trust, and that breaches of trust should be voiced and acted upon. Modern society has become so inorganic and privatised that we lack any faith in the possibilities of honourable trust, and we don't even understand spontaneous common purpose. But the kind of social relationships that we actually long for are not possible without the restoration of honour, and the restoration of open spaces. Squares restored to full vitality can be spaces that offer people the possibility to be together without compulsion or without being affected by the distortions of an excessively regulated and commercialised society, and may encourage honourable behaviour, civic honour even, and a new trust in each other if these words themselves have not been dishonoured. That's it.
Thank you very much, Des. And I actually omitted to say that the title of your talk, which you took us on a very interesting tour to the social construction of the European City Square. And I'm going to Rome soon, and I'm definitely going to see as many as possible.